Hello, I'm Sam Breakgear and welcome to the Sociable podcast. On today's show, we have a very short Weird Wide Web segment, which is going to look at how a machine learning algorithm can detect whether or not tweets are sent while drunk. And for our main story today, we're going to be looking at how blockchain technology is helping to tackle the opioid crisis in a number of ways. To find out more on this subject, I spoke with Tori Adams. She leads the public sector area of ConsenSys, a blockchain technology company based on Ethereum. And rather than me trying to explain exactly what she does or what the company does, I think it's better if I leave it for her to explain. So without further ado, here is our call. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you have a pretty busy schedule. You've just come back from South by Southwest, right?
That's correct. It was great down there, but exhausting.
Yeah? What was the highlight?
What was the highlight? Well, I suppose the professional highlight was being on a panel with Dr. Vanilla Singh, Health and Human Services, and she's the Chief Medical Officer there, and talking with her about the opioid epidemic. And the fun highlight was seeing the Good Omens pavilion that Amazon had.
Ah, fantastic. I'm really glad you enjoyed yourself. I'm very jealous. Hopefully I'd like to make it down there myself one day. It's on the list. So I suppose if we want to start off, I understand you work for ConsenSys Public Sector Practice out of Washington, D.C. Would you be able to explain what ConsenSys is for our listeners?
Sure. So ConsenSys was started about 3 years ago by Joe Lubin, who was one of the people that was involved in the Ethereum project, which was the first attempt to develop a blockchain that went beyond Bitcoin and to create a programmable blockchain that would allow us to do all kinds of things. And ConsenSys came out of Joe Ethereum project. And right now, today, we are the largest pure play Ethereum blockchain firm in the world. There's about 1,200 of us in 22 different countries. Most of us are based in Paris, London, Dublin, New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Singapore, and the Philippines. We do 4 or 5 things, depending on how you count them. First, we maintain the Ethereum blockchain and build it out. If you've ever used Ethereum, you've used one of our products, MetaMask. All developers use it, Infura, and we do a lot of things to advance it into the next stage. So Pegasus is the next evolution of the Ethereum chain, and we're working hard to deliver that. Secondly, we develop products that can be used in Ethereum. I think we have about 30 different products in different stages of evolution. Those range from a supply chain product, Viant, down to things that are a little bit more like putting some AI onto blockchain. We also do education. We do everything from code school to C-suite. And then we also provide solutions, which is sort of bespoke enterprise for solutions for government and enterprises. And then finally, we invest in companies. We run a $50 million venture capital fund, and we also focus on taking companies that come to us that want to do ICOs or similar kind offerings and taking them from white paper all the way through to the other end of getting regulatory compliance and issuing their coin.
Impressive. That's a very long list.
It is.
What is your role at the company?
So what I do is I lead up the public sector work, specifically right now focusing on the U.S. public sector because, it's the biggest in the world. So what we've been trying to do is to develop applications that fit within the broad span of government and the public sector, which varies from country to country. Socially responsible applications. And within that, I focus a lot on health and specifically on the opioid epidemic.
Mm-hmm. And your time during in South by Southwest, that was for a talk on how blockchain can tackle the opioid epidemic.
That is.
I'd be interested to know what the outcome of that talk was like, and if blockchain can indeed tackle the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, so let's put this into a little bit of perspective to begin with. So the opioid epidemic is one of the greatest public health crises that has hit the United States in the 20th century. Right now, an American dies every 19 minutes from an opioid overdose. Last year, we're talking about 75,000 people. Since the epidemic began, more than 600,000 people have died of opioid overdoses in the US, which makes death larger of America's wars. It is an amazing tragedy that has occurred and largely snuck up on us. And we in ConsenSys have been very focused on what we can do to help this. I first became interested in all of this because my daughter is an opioid addict. She's currently in recovery, but she had been a heroin addict for 10 years, and I thought, man, I got to do something about this. I've got to find a way to do anything I can. And so we started to focus on what we could do, and we narrowed it down to a couple of areas. One of the ones we can do is to help stop pill diversion. So a big source of the epidemic initially was pills that were prescribed to deal with pain being diverted from their intended use. And if you think about the production cycle that are used to produce the pills, then to manufacturer, then to a wholesaler, then to a distributor, then to a pharmacy, and then out to the patient. And right now, those supply chains are frighteningly manual. And there's a lot of pill diversion that has historically happened, either from outright robbery, but more often than not, fraud within the system. So we've been working to develop blockchain-based systems that we think can eliminate a lot of the diversion and a lot of the theft within those chains. And essentially, every transaction, every step that occurs along the process is noted down within the blockchain. We're recording the weights from the pallet using IoT devices, so we know exactly, say, when a weight of a contributor chemical to the production of, say, fentanyl changes. We can look into each stage of it and identify might be potential diversion. So we see supply chain as being an extremely important effect. Secondly, we see within the prescribing system, there's something we can do. Right now in the States, there are such things known as prescription drug management systems, PDMPs, programs, rather systems, sorry. And each state has a PDMP. And these systems record when a opiate has been prescribed. But unfortunately, they're on a state-by-state basis. So if I'm in West Virginia, for instance, I can fill my prescription for OxyContin, a very powerful opioid, in West Virginia. And then I can go across the border to Ohio and fill it again in Ohio. Now, by using blockchain, we can guarantee to retain the anonymity of the patient. We can ensure the data is not overly shared, but at the same time track when that prescription has been filled. So we will know that it's been filled in West Virginia, and therefore we can put up a smart contract that will block it from being filled in Ohio. We've even started to work with folks who are developing smart pill bottles. And these pill bottles will only deliver you 1 pill a day or 2 pills a day at a set timing that has been established. And when that pill is delivered, it writes onto the blockchain automatically that the dose has been given. So this is going to prevent fraud. It's going to allow us to keep a record of that, and it's going to allow us to understand how people are taking their medication. One of the big dangers there is, of course, that what people suffering from opioid abuse disorder do is frequently, if they get pills, you take them, you smush them down, and either snort them. You get into a solution where you can then inject them. So by controlling the dose from that bottle and being able to track exactly when and even who by thumbprints and other biometrics is taking it out, we can control the dispensing of it and ensure that we're not seeing the terrible things that happened early on in the epidemic when you had opioid pills really driving the addiction. Now, since then, the epidemic's moved on. Pills are still an important part. They're still a critical element of managing the epidemic, but we've moved on to heroin and then fentanyl and then carfentanil. Fentanyl is about 100 times more powerful than morphine. Carfentanil about 1,000 times. So we're talking grains of things that can be lethal doses. And I tend to see this problem as a stock and flow problem. So there's a flow of people into the addiction system and stock of people already in there. So what I've talked about so far is really focused on that flow into the system. How can we prevent people from becoming addicted by the use of pain pills? And as little as 4 weeks of using pain pills on a regular basis can addict someone. So if you're coming back from the doctor with an injury in the past, you might be prescribed that number of pills such that you could become addicted from a relatively minor injury. My own daughter became addicted to pain pills and then later to heroin, starting out with oral surgery when she had her wisdom teeth out. And they gave her almost 3 weeks worth of pills, and that was enough for her to become addicted. So the things I've talked about so far are how can we control that flow? How can we stop that overprescribing and overuse? When we get to that stock of people, those people that are already in the addiction system, one of the biggest problems that we face in the US is being able to track patients and discover what treatments work. We know broadly what does work when it comes to medication-assisted treatment. What we don't really know is how these particular treatments interact with lifestyle factors. Are you homeless? Do you have a stable home situation? Are you employed? All of these kind of things. And also genetic and epigenetic factors. What is the characteristics of your biology and your genetics and your upbringing? And one of the biggest problems, because we have such a disaggregated healthcare system in the US, is we don't know what treatment somebody can get. They might be treated by medical assisted treatment with drugs like Vivitrol, which is an opioid antagonist, or buprenorphine, which is a substitute you would take for opioids. And at the same time, they might be receiving other health care that might be contrary to those factors. They might have brushes with the law, brushes with homelessness, all kinds of things going on. Essentially, what we lack is a single record of their interactions, not just with healthcare providers, but with police, with social services, all kinds of things. And what we've been trying to do is develop an identity on the blockchain that allows the person suffering from opioid abuse disorder to control their own data, their own identity, so they are not affected by the stigma and shame of addiction, and to be able to record those interactions then, such that when a medical professional sees them for treatment, they can see what they've had, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what might be aggravating factors. You know, the story in DC of the $1 Million Marine, who was a retired Marine, who was then going to the Veterans Administration, the VA, for an injury and became addicted to opioids and ended up being bounced around the VA, DC Health Services, the police, homeless services. And when it finally came to light and all this was added up, it was discovered $1 million had been spent on this man in a year. And nobody was tracking this. No one was understanding that one side was doing something that another side said wouldn't, was disrupting that. So by having this single ID on a phone that will allow people to access services, will allow people to preserve their data, and will also give those attestations, as we say, that they are eligible for something. So when a cop finds with buprenorphine, he's not going to bust me as he might do saying I have an opiate or I'm trading buprenorphine on the street. He can actually look at my phone and see, no, I've been prescribed this. I'm authorized to carry this. So it's going to cut down on that and also create a record that we can begin to understand what works. And the other thing that we hope from this that we'll be able to start doing is to begin to understand what is working in terms of longer term treatment, the 30 days or the 90 days that somebody is in a rehab center, and what things are ineffective and what things are out and out fraud. Now, we know there's an unknown amount of fraud in the drug treatment sector within the United States. We don't know how big it is. We think it's pretty big. We know from places where fraudulent rings have been busted, where somebody will set up a rehab center, they will take patients, and they will just warehouse them for 30 days and kick them out. We know that this can actually get much worse. A chain of rehab centers in Pennsylvania actually turned out to be an active drug distribution ring that was trading some of the worst drugs you can imagine and simply taking advantage of that. We know there's patient brokering. My daughter, who I say is a recovering addict, regularly gets texts from patient brokers who say, do you know any addicts who have insurance, health insurance? If so, I will give you $100 for every one you send to me. They then take them, send them on to a phony baloney clinic. That clinic treats them for 30 days or maybe doesn't even treat them for 30 days and kicks back some money to them. At the end of that 30 days, they relapse or they never got sober to begin with. They go back out on the streets. The patient broker then sells them on to another part until the insurance is exhausted. Now, there's no listing, there's no rating of these treatment centers. So being able to track a person suffering from opioid abuse disorders as they move through different centers, as they develop a record of their treatment, will enable us to start understanding which of these are not delivering treatment at all, which are being complete frauds, and which are doing something as ineffective. For instance, when you are trying to get somebody into a treatment center, the way it is pitched is frequently it's pitched to the family because they're the people that try and get somebody in there. And it's talking about the greenery and how wonderful it is, and they've got a swimming pool and they've got, horses on the site and all of this kind of stuff. Fairly bougie stuff. Now, that sounds very nice. The evidence that that works is very slim, and you're really selling the family. What we want to know is if something like equine therapy really works, and we don't have the data. So, yes, being around horses is probably very nice, but is it an effective treatment for addicts? There are case studies, there are stories, but we don't have the data we need. And by being able to start tracking people while they own their data, which is what blockchain can do, and you can keep and control your data. So we're not infringing your privacy, but being able to say you went to this place, you had this, then we can start to see your story and your history through time and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And that becomes very powerful. And the key thing that we're trying to do here is to be able to bring the person suffering from addiction into their treatment, to know that we're not shunning them, we're not turning our backs on them, but we're saying you have a vital role here with your data, with controlling what you say to us and what you don't say to us. We're not coming in and saying everything is open. We're saying, here's this thing, the blockchain. And what the blockchain can do is it can give you that sovereignty and that control over your data. And let us help you by giving you this right to control what's happening. And then we start to think of some fancier ideas of maybe we can begin to put bounties and rewards on to that identity app, going through where perhaps if you've been sober for 10 days, we say, hey, if you're sober for 10 days, we're going to give you a crypto bounty. And that bounty might just be enough to make you think about it a little bit more, whether you want to relapse that night. We can begin to experiment with kinds of rewards then, see what works. We can also work with rehab centers to say, look, we'll pay you the 15 to 30 grand up front, as insurance companies do, and we're trying to work with insurance. But what we'll do is we'll say, we'll give you 50% more as a crypto bounty if you can work with that addict when they leave your facility to see that they're sober 15 days after they leave, 30 days after they leave, 45, and so on, to create that bounty system to incentivize people while again keeping their privacy, keeping their control of their data, dealing with concerns about data sharing within the medical sphere, to manage that such that we're creating incentives and bounties to ensure that information is protected, but folks are incentivized to behave in the right way. Now, we talked about these things on that panel, and on that panel was a DA, a former DA from a county in Texas, from a high-level public health official in the U.S., and some folks from IT companies like myself. Booz Allen Hamilton was there, and then ConsenSys. And I think the consensus was that this is something that can help. Is it going to solve the problem? Is it going to stop those 75,000 deaths a year? Probably not. Are we going to take a few percentage points off that? Probably. We can probably do that. We can help the flow, dim the flow of folks in, and we can help reduce that stock. So it's a contributory solution to the opioid epidemic. It's not going to solve it. No one thing is going to solve it. This is a complex socio-economic, biological problem that has emerged from how technology has developed and how our society has developed. But it's something that can help, and that's really what we're focused on.
No, that's important. You're right. It's a sad situation, like you said, is crept up on us, and I think it's a result of many factors. And I think tackling the problem the solution will be a result of many factors. And what you're doing sounds very impressive. A combination of technology and obviously psychology of positive reinforcement and keeping a really strict record, I think is going to be essential. Do you think that in 3 years' time the situation will be better and we'll start moving towards a situation where the death's on decline or addiction's on decline, or do you think that right now is the situation getting worse, and do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
Unfortunately, it's going to get worse before it gets better. We're only beginning to grapple with fentanyl and carfentanil within the system, and we're the way that the federal government and state and state governments are focusing on this is very much on the law enforcement approach. There's a lot of money going into public health, education, and into treatment. But, we're still concerned about imports of fentanyl from China or Southeast Asia and the role of the cartels and all of this. And that's great. Yeah, there's a place for that. We should be concerned about that. But until we address the folks who are already in active addiction and the reasons why people become addicted, we're going to have a problem. And sort of stepping out a little bit from the blockchain perspective, we've got to accept that drug use and addiction is something that's going to occur. One of the main reasons that are leading to death right now is when you take a shot or when you smoke something, you don't know if the thing you're smoking has a high dosage within it of carfentanil or is mainly baby powder. If every time you took an aspirin, you didn't know if that aspirin had arsenic in it, or if it was aspirin, we'd have a lot of deaths from aspirin. So we have to move to a situation where people can feel safe to test their drugs, for instance, where there has, now we have to move to a harm reduction thing where people can get access to naloxone, which is going to prevent overdose deaths by being able to bring people around, needle share, clean needles to prevent needle sharing, being able to get clean gauze to prevent the sharing of blooded gauze to cut down on the HIV impacts. And we need a situation where people can inject safely or use drugs in a safe manner, and to be able to test those. Now, again, I think the blockchain can play a role in ensuring you have an identity, that you have a right to these services without fearing prosecution by the police. And I think by preserving an identity there and showing you can use these services, that will help. And I focus on harm reduction there because you can't treat a dead person. If a person's dead from overdose or from using a product that is contaminated, then there's nothing more you can help somebody. You've got to keep them alive long enough. So I think we have to have an acceptance of that. I think we need to look more closely into what legalization of marijuana can do. I was speaking with a physician over the weekend who's saying, in dealing with chronic pain and dealing with addiction, marijuana is showing to be extremely useful. Folks in Colorado, in California have seen real benefits from this. And, rather than going straight to opioids, we really need to consider that. There are various things that we can do in really understanding the complex biological and behavioral characteristics of seeing that somebody doesn't necessarily get sober straight away and stay sober. This is a chronic relapsing disease, and we need to model our public health interventions around making sure when someone relapses, they don't fall out of the system again. So, is any of that happening? Boy, it's happening slowly, right? It's happening slowly, and Europe is, as always, further ahead than the US. So I think the projections right now show the epidemic peaking sometime in the early 2020s. And then we would expect it to go then. What we know from the past is drug epidemics are cyclical. They come and they go. Essentially, enough people see the effects of something that it begins to cause a societal change in behavior. After the Vietnam War, a very large number of Americans serving in Southeast Asia had used opioids as heroin or as opium, and there was a huge expected addiction crisis that was thought to follow. And while we did see a bump in the 70s, it quickly subsided. And we don't really understand why, apart from society changed a lot and people were taking drugs under certain stresses. And when things like those big social changes happen and generational changes happen, it's often that people age out of addiction if they can live long enough, and that society changes so to discourage people from entering it. Now, I'm not saying we should bet on that, but we do know that things like that occur. We know that crack was very big, and then crack subsided, and meth took off. We see these cycles of addiction. So why we don't understand that is, of course, we don't have individualized data. We don't have that data. Now, through other 4R technologies like genetic profiling and genetic engineering, we're getting the ability to be able to look more down into why someone changes and other people don't, and how we can treat that. And again, keeping the security of that data is really important. And again, blockchain can play a big role there. But as we go forward, that will help us understand how these things change and what's going on.
Well, it sounds like you're doing incredible work. Like you said, I'm not sure there's going to be one single solution, but it sounds like what you're doing and what ConsenSys is doing could play a huge pivotal role.
We hope so.
I really wish you the best, and thank you so much. Thank you for your time as well today.
Thank you very much. Look after yourself. Bye.
Excellent. Take care, Tori. Bye.
Weird Wide Web.
This week's Weird Wide Web story is a short one. It's regarding a story from the MIT Technology Review, which states that Nabil Hussain and some friends at the University of Rochester have created a machine learning algorithm which can identify tweets sent under the influence of alcohol. The methodology is quite complex, but you can find a link to the article on our website which explains it in full detail. But personally, I would love to see what the algorithm makes of Donald Trump's tweets, especially considering he doesn't drink. That's our show for today. You can find all the details from today's show on our website at sociable.co. Thanks for listening.